Very most welcome evening to all of you. Today we're not really going to talk about Atlanticism that much, as we're going to talk about China. So it's my pleasure to introduce you on my left, Matt Ferchen, who is special in Chinese political economy, and Mohammadbagher Forough from Leiden University, who has an expertise in the One Belt, One Road.
So basically, some of the big shifts, I'm going to start basically give a context for our conversation. There are some geopolitical shifts going on around the world. The multipolar world is emerging after the bipolar world of Cold War, and then during the 90s, after the Soviet Union's collapse, the American unipolar moment arrived, the end of history and all the self-congratulation, but then it ended with the rise of China and other return of Russia. Transatlantic alliance, this is no longer an alliance, it's becoming a selective partnership, meaning that Europe and the US are no longer automatically in agreement when it comes to each and every topic, like it used to be, almost like that. I was in a meeting in SWP in Berlin where politicians, the Republican Party from the US, and then some Merkel advisors, and one of the Merkel advisors basically talking about the German perspective on this brutally honestly and saying that the transatlantic alliance is over, and this is no longer even about the presidency of Donald Trump. It's about a historic shift that has taken place. So it's becoming a selective partnership. And the example she gave, and I agree with her, is that she said when it comes to the nuclear agreement, we're going to side with Iran, China, and Russia, and not you. When it comes to the Paris Climate Agreement, we're going to side with China and not you. When it comes to Iranian missiles, we're going to side with you and not Russia. So it's becoming selective, not automatic agreement between European powers and America. And then we have geo-economic shift. So if you like, if you look at the ancient map, this is a random moment in ancient Silk Road, 400 AD. So basically, if you look at that map, not only in 400 AD, but at any random moment, you can see that there's basically a lot of similarity, not identical, but very similar to the 2018-2019 infrastructure map that is going on in what we call Eurasia, and some scholar are calling it Afro-Eurasia, because Africa, not for the short term, but the medium term and the long term, is going to be a huge part of the global economy. And China and India, especially China, by far the most serious investors. And America and Europe are so far behind that China and India are already disappearing. Sorry, I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news. But this is something that, at least as a discourse, is rising. So Belt and Road Initiative is not only about geoeconomics and geopolitics, it's also about culture. Tim Winter says in his article, we're now seeing a surge in Silk Road nominations at UNESCO's annual World Heritage Committee meetings, with the Belt and Road dramatically changing the political impetus for cultural sector cooperation. So also another issue that is, I think, as far as I know, happening for the first time in human history is reorganizing human geography. This is basically, BRI is the biggest geographic re-engineering that any civilization has tried to do in human history consciously. Now, starting from 2013, started with a Chinese vision. They say it's for everyone to participate in, and I think it's true to a certain extent. And this is the first time in human history that the global economic geography is being re-engineered in terms of corridors. So China has introduced 6 corridors: the BRI, China, Central Asia, West Asia economic corridor. So this is also an interesting thing because the Middle Eastern actors and Chinese actors are no longer using the concept of Middle East. So even the naming and the self-perception and identity of regions are changing. It's not about only one railroad, it's about what kind of world we're entering, what do we want to call ourselves. If you look at China, you will see that China is practically, not technically, the only major power in the world that is practically landlocked. And not technically, of course, because they have access to international waters here in the South China Sea, but this is some of the most claustrophobic, if not the most claustrophobic waters of the world, and all sorts of tensions that you know, the 9-dash line and so forth. So, one of the important strategic choke points, if you look at the world from a Chinese perspective, is the Malacca, the Strait of Malacca, which is the most strategically important choke point around the world, because between these two oceans, the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, this is the only seriously navigable body of water. And of course, when you are on the waters, you see the domination of the American Navy. So what the Chinese do is changing the game. Instead of playing the American game of geopolitics, I think they're changing the game by introducing the geo-economics, by basically doing more in geo-economics and bringing more stuff on land, and also creating changes in global geography in order to bypass this problem. If anyone, including America, closes this strait, it will suffocate the global economy. Basically, this is the global center of gravity, economically speaking. Asia is the global center of gravity, and the whole thing depends on the Strait of Malacca for passage of energy, commodities, export, import. Basically, China can have access to international waters because they can have access to international waters from Myanmar and then not be dependent or basically subject to American naval dominance. Also, of course, China is building a lot of infrastructure, highways, railways, tunnels, on land. Traditionally, China has been more of a land power than a naval power. So in terms of infrastructure, and now with the Huawei story and digital infrastructure, China is of course very good in some areas, definitely number one. And then they're going to build roads and highways and railways and basically connect economies together, and this is why countries are getting super excited about this. And again, the relationship between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Because of geopolitical reasons, Western businesses never entered some places that Chinese businesses are entering, like Pakistan, like places with unrest in Africa, places that have been rendered geopoliticized, basically. So China, in a sense, is intervening in global geography by converting those geopoliticized countries and geo-economizing them by introducing a new thing.
Thank you very much for introducing this term geopolitical and then turning to geo-economical. I understand this afternoon I was completely new to the word, but if you want to talk about China, you have to use the word geo-economical. And luckily you have much more knowledge about that. So we're very keen to hear from you sort of how we should be seeing China then.
So let me begin by trying to make some sense of what I see happening in these, again, broadly mirrored similar discussions that I see having evolved on both sides of the Atlantic over the last 2 or 3 years, especially when it comes to China. Ideas like China being a systemic rival in the European Commission report, among other things, and in the US context, a strategic competitor as part of a new concept of great power competition. So I think of this sort of emergent set of ideas about the need to rethink the relationship with China as related to 5 different categories of concerns. So the first of them being business. So business communities on both sides of the Atlantic express relatively similar concerns when it comes to China. Issues like market access, technology transfer, intellectual property rights, and then broadly speaking, the challenge of China's industrial policy. A lot of the discussions that you see, including in China by the American Chamber of Commerce or the European Chamber of Commerce, tend to focus on this set of issues. You see this set of issues featuring largely in the trade negotiations. So business, and especially the American business community, I think, being willing to engage on some of these issues in a little bit of a different way than they had been in the past. The business community has been willing to be at the forefront of voicing some of these concerns and what they want out of the trade negotiations. So that's first. National security concerns. We see this in some more traditional sectors, so in military sense, South China Sea, the term that China is becoming increasingly assertive is one that's been around for a while, but certainly this idea of China as a strategic competitor and this switch in the US defense national strategy to focus on great power competition as opposed to terrorism, which dominated in the post 9/11 era. But then there are other elements of this too, which are maybe some non-traditional security issues, which I think are more shared on both sides. And a lot of that related then to issues like 5G, Huawei, or the investment screening processes that we see under discussion in the in Europe, certainly are at this intersection between national security and business issues. And more generally, concerns about China, and you just mentioned the term geo-economic strategy. I think in most of the discourse in the United States, and certainly in places like India, geo-economics is used as a term of concern about China's role in the world, especially the sense that things like the Belt and Road are not simply commercial, but they have implications for China's power and influence and are part of a broader geostrategy. If you take this to its fullest extent, that you may read then the BRI as something like a Trojan horse. Human rights concerns, especially about an emergent surveillance state in China and the application of emerging technologies, including facial recognition technologies, concerns that the Chinese state and the Communist Party are increasingly repressive. Academia, concerns about academic freedom and the restrictions of academic freedom in China itself. You see emerging discussions, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic in the last couple of years about scholars who self-censor, those who maybe were unwilling to discuss or research sensitive topics, including things like Xinjiang. And then media, which tends to amplify many of these issues, often in an extreme way, and you get a lot of journalists then who are also doing some of the investigative reporting on many of these different issues and are bringing to light various aspects of it. I see a general overlap and often in very complex ways interweaving of this broad set of categories and groups feeding into the discussion on both sides of the Atlantic about why China is now thought of, again, as among other things, a systemic rival or a strategic competitor. What is going on behind all of this? Or what's the motivation behind it all? I would say there's no clear answer to this, but there are at least two ways in which we could look at it. One of them is sort of what's happening on the Chinese side, and the other is what's happening in general in this US-Europe side of things. Certainly the discussion, I think, in the West about what's happening in China is associated with two things. One of them is that China has stopped or reversed its liberalization both economically and politically. That hoped for reforms, there's no hope anymore. So there is a sense of disappointment, of disappointed liberalization. And then there are sort of new components at both the domestic and foreign policy levels. Domestically, the way in which Xi Jinping has taken the reins of power in China for himself, seemingly done away with a more consensual decision-making and leadership transition process, and then sort of reasserting the dominance of the Chinese Communist Party in all aspects. And then on the foreign policy front, that China is newly energetic or assertive. But then there's the other sort of obvious question of what has changed in the West. At least a key part of the answer in the United States corresponds quite directly with the Trump administration. So in a sense, someone referred to this as the Trump administration and the trade negotiations as pushing on an open door, to the extent that this is sort of building up into a potentially very long-term strategic rivalry. All right, let me talk for just a couple of minutes about the areas where I think there may be possible changes in this consensus. I would look in particular in the United States case to the 2020 election cycle, which has already begun. Not necessarily for any kind of fundamental change in a reassessment of the concerns and questions that I've just laid out, but in approaches. in terms of how the United States may going about dealing with this, and also particular issue areas. I would think that at some point, when there is a transition to a democratic presidency in the United States, whether that's in next year or in the next election cycle or later on, that we would see at the very least a reassessment of the role of environment and climate issues and energy issues in the relationship with China, and the sense that the United States needs to potentially work with allies on this. So this was obviously during the previous administration an area where China, the United States, and Europe were in general agreement about the need to confront and deal with these issues. So much more to say, but I will leave it here for now and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
We talked about the strategy and the strength of China. My question is, what do you see as their weaknesses?
The main weakness of China, I would say, it's internal tensions. It's a little bit paradoxical, so I'm going to go for this paradoxical argument that it's the main weakness of China and at the same time the most significant strength of China. The Chinese obsession with its own internal cohesion and, as they call it, harmony. It's already such a complex country in and of itself that if the main problem or the worst fear of Xi Jinping would be when the economic growth becomes like so low or becomes negative that the Chinese population gets basically frustrated with the political system.
How should we re-engage with Africa if we've let it slip a bit since the end of the Cold War?
But Africa will quickly say, yes, invest, invest, invest. And like I said, in any situation in life, I would prefer more voices. So even if in Africa we have more voices, especially voices from actors like European Union that have more of a normative force, I would prefer that to be competing with China so that China can also become more moderate and more beneficial to the African nations, because then they have to compete with European companies.
And I have a question about climate change, because we can see that the US and China have quite different approaches to climate change, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate maybe on the geopolitical implications.
On the climate change issue, I think this is a really interesting one. I think that the lack of American engagement on this is extremely challenging for the domestic pressure that many have worked for a long time in China to put on their own government. I have heard that it is extremely difficult now for environmental activists in China on water, on air, on a variety of things where they made a lot of progress, including in the sort of post-2008 era, but especially then after the United States and China agreed to have this as sort of the center, one of their centerpieces. Without the United States pressure on this, my understanding is that in China, many of these advocates for better air, for better water, for many different things are having a much more difficult time. This then matters for Europe. If the United States is not engaged on this, it matters most for the Chinese people, but then it matters for everyone. And I think many people in China see it this way.
I would like to ask, what's your opinion about the 5G discussion that's currently going on with China and the West?
One thing that we can learn from them is the focus on infrastructure. One thing that has made Huawei almost unbeatable is their focus on infrastructure, whereas most Western companies did not focus. And now suddenly we see that they have become the #1 in 5G, and they're already investing in 6G, by the way. So that's something, no matter you consider China friend, enemy, or just neutral or systemic rival as European Union does it, you can always learn from other people.
You left us, both of you, with a lot of food for thought. I would want to ask you to give a warm applause to both our speakers. Thank you very much.